of, I'll cite, and I think the Russians should actually understand this well. I've thought about this in the past, but this is the main argument of Tolstoy's War and Peace. That what's important here is, Russian nationalism. That was how the Russians defeated Napoleon's army outside of Moscow. And here you have the Ukrainians fighting for their country. They have skin in the game. And again, they have been doing this, for almost a decade. And I think that the Ukrainian side is really important here. And so I think we can cite all of the problems with the Russian military, and I think there are a lot of them. And I think a lot of critics, there are a lot of critics who are sort of further to the right of Putin, if there is such a thing, who have been very critical of the Russian military for multiple reasons, including some of those I've cited. And so I think it's a little bit of, the superpower not looking very much like a superpower, but also the underdog outperforming what we would have thought the underdog would have performed.
Right. Steve, do you want to pick up?
Okay. Where are we now? I'm very pessimistic in a number of respects about the state of this conflict right now and in the future. Hopefully I'll have time to sort of elaborate this general thesis. But in a nutshell, I think this is almost certainly very likely is an unwinnable war for both sides. And I'll talk about what I think the core objectives are of each side. But given what I've seen so far in the last year, I don't see it very likely that either side is going to be able to achieve strategic military victory, or military rout of the other side. And I don't think either side is going to be able to achieve what I think, it's hard to know exactly, but what I think are their core objectives with Ukraine and Russia, and for that matter, the West, because it's not just Ukraine that has war aims, political aims, it's the West. But the way you set up the question, it reminded me, there's sort of a thought experiment I wanted to, or I thought maybe I'd bring up to sort of counter what I see is excessive optimism in the Western policy community, scholarly community, analysts, and among politicians as well. In fact, a couple of weeks ago, a U.S. member of the U.S. Department of Defense made a statement something like, Russia has lost strategically, operationally, and tactically. I don't see it that way. Imagine, if you will, that we're visited by aliens, maybe in a balloon. They're observing this conflict among these two earthling societies, and they're asking themselves, well, who's winning? And they note, they don't know really any of the details, but they look down from the balloon and they see that there are about 200,000 armed troops of state B on the territory of state A, and 0 armed troops of state A on the territory of state B. Secondly, they analyze, well, what's the territorial control in this battle? And they see that, well, in 2014, state B acquired 16,000 square miles of territory, Ukrainian territory. That's Crimea and parts of Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast, regions, provinces. And then since the war started in February last year, they acquired additional territory. Now they control 33,000 square miles. And again, state A controls 0 territory of state B. And these aliens are going to notice, they're going to wonder, well, how are civilians faring in this war? It's the sort of humanitarian cost for each side. And they noticed that one side has lost, well, a third of one side's population has either fled the country as refugees or they're internally displaced, a third. And on the other side, state B, of course, which is Russia, state B, yeah, it's lost maybe 300,000, we don't know for sure, of people who have fled. Maybe a lot of them to dodge the draft, many of them for political reasons as well. They don't want to live in such a regime, but maybe about 300,000 compared to 14.5 million for state A. Then they're interested in knowing, well, how many civilians have died on each of these, for each of these warring parties. UN a couple of days ago, I think, came out with an estimate that is at least 16,000 Ukrainian civilian deaths. And that's a very general number. Nobody knows for sure, but it's only a rough estimate. They acknowledge it could go way higher. On the other side, state B, I tried to Google this. I don't remember reporting of any civilian casualties, but there are deaths in Russia. There may be some because Ukraine launched some missiles into Crimea and into the area near Belgorod, which is a staging territory.
Someone died in Belgium.
Yeah, I suspect also. I have a vague memory of that, but I couldn't find any mention on Google, about the entire internet, of Russian civilian casualties. Let's say it's 10, even 20. I doubt it's even that. Compared to 16,000 or more. And then the aliens are going to look at the state of property damage. The the World Bank in December came out with an estimate of reconstruction costs after this war is over. Given the state of destruction as of now, say nothing moving forward with the state of destruction. And so the aliens look it up right now, and they observe, or they read this report that says that the estimated cost of reconstructing Ukraine is $525 to $635 billion. Property damage on the Russian side, it's hard to even say what would count as property damage. There have been some military targets struck, Russian territory and Crimea. And yes, we need to be aware that there's economic sanctions against Russia. There have been some costs that have been paid. Most of those costs, economic costs, would be in the future, though. Those are sort of uncertain, unknown economic costs. But we know already, anybody who watches the news, you can see the destruction, utter destruction of large swaths of southern and eastern Ukraine. So it's hard for me to understand. Well, I can understand to some degree this perspective that Ukraine is winning because it's against the expectations, right? Things are extremely terrible in Ukraine, but they could have been even more extremely terrible. So we're going to count that as some sense of success. But if you don't look at it that way, and in this analysis, I'm just looking at sort of where we are now. One side is in bad shape. Now, I'm not saying the fact that my overall argument is neither side militarily is going to be successful. They're not going to achieve their fundamental political objectives. But I just wanted to sort of set this stage up and emphasize what I see as this huge asymmetry and which side has suffered more so far. And yes, of course, it's amazing, the resistance of the Ukrainians, the national pride, the unity, all this, it's truly inspiring and amazing, right? I think that goes without saying, but Ukraine or Russia remains a formidable force. And one of the things I wanted to emphasize was sort of the incentives that Russia has to carry this fight on and to try to achieve at least some semblance of victory, military victory and political victory. But if you had another question, I could.
Well, let's
maybe
have kind of one more broad
with-
one, and then we can kind of do a deep dive. And I just kind of two observations. I was watching Tim Snyder on an interview last night, and the interviewer said, "So, why does this matter? What are the consequences?" And he said, I don't know, but all I can tell you is 100 years from now, historians are going to be writing about this moment. He said it's, and then I want to read just a couple sentences from Elliot Cohen in today's Atlantic. And he said, the Russia-Ukraine war is not merely a humanitarian calamity, a monstrous collection of crimes against humanity, a gross violation of solemn agreements and international law. It is also a watershed in which much will be determined about the future of the international system. It could lead to a very dark place, not different in kind from that of the 1930s or 1940s, if the dictators get their way. But if liberal democracies unite and display the resolve, enterprise, and military capacity that they've shown before, that outcome can still be avoided.
This is Snyder.
Yeah, no, this is
Okay.
actually Elliot Cohen.
Elliot Cohen, okay, yeah.
But so, I mean, what are the consequences? I mean, is it literally the future of the international rules-based orders since World War II?
Well, it's interesting how he's, is this to me?
Yep, yeah, both.
It's interesting how Elliot Cohen, and I've read some of his stuff, his analysis of this. So if we give in to the dictator, right, it's something that was the spirit of that, then these potentially catastrophic results will follow. I think more likely the catastrophic outcome. We're going to talk about extremely undesirable outcomes, is from precisely pursuing total victory, quote unquote, in this war against Russia. And I'm, of course, referring to the possibility of direct confrontation, direct military conflict between NATO and Russia, and the possibility of the use of nuclear weapons. I have lots of thoughts on nuclear weapons because ask me, I can go into more detail. But Russia is a highly, my analysis, the core of my analysis for why I think it's going to be hard to defeat Russia. Now, I have an argument for why it's going to be hard to defeat Ukraine as well. But I think maybe more interesting for you guys is why I think it will be so hard to defeat in any sense that the Ukrainians consider a victory. How it will be very hard to achieve those kinds of military and political goals for Ukraine / the West. One is the incentive structure, and just brief, I mean, at the very most superficial level, the Ukrainian, the Russian state is the perception is that the Russian state is threatened to an even greater degree now than it was prior to the war, due to the expansion of NATO into Ukraine, much greater than it was before. NATO is likely to expand with Sweden and Finland joining. Most NATO states have committed themselves to increasing their military spending. So the threat, the perceived threat at least, right? But the Russian state is much higher now than it was before. The threat to national identity is higher now than it was prior to February 24th of last year. What I mean by that, the prestige and the status of the Russian nation has been dealt a crushing blow by a series of stunning battlefield defeats in this war. Lots of Western leaders, analysts, people on social media are calling for reparations, massive reparations from Russia for war crimes, trials, tribunals. This is also a potential national humiliation for Russians, not just for Putin, for Russians. I'm talking about Russian national identity, Russian nationhood. All this talk and the possibility that they're going to have to pay for tens of billions, maybe hundreds of billions of dollars in reparations, and see not just their leaders be tried in various tribunals, but average everyday soldiers. Now let's move on to the level of the regime, the autocracy, the authoritarian regime in Russia. I do buy the argument to some degree Putin was just that Russia, let's call it Russia right now, was very disturbed by the westward integration, military integration of Ukraine into Europe and the West, economic integration, and those things are very closely related. Why? Because that kind of Western integration makes it much more likely that Ukraine will be a prosperous country and a democratic and a stable country, in contrast to Russia. And that this demonstration effect is indeed a threat to the legitimacy of Russian authoritarianism. But that threat is even greater now because if there's not a substantial Russian military victory, almost certainly what's going to happen is NATO is going to absorb even to a greater extent Ukraine. The EU is also going to be, it's already accepted as a candidate member 2 months ago into the EU, an accelerated route to incorporate it as a full member. So this is a strong motivation for the elites, the oligarchs, and the elites that are prospering in this corrupt, kleptocratic Russian system. And then Putin himself, his reputation, his historical legacy, his reputation as a leader, his life perhaps, or his freedom, they're all at stake here to a degree much greater than prior to the invasion. So you got the Russian state, the Russian nation, the Russian regime, and the Russian autocrat, all having substantial, I think strong incentive to tap into, to a greater extent than they have already, tap into Russian economic and military potential to prosecute this war and to at least achieve some semblance of military victory. And then there's the two aces in the hole. It's not, of course, when you fight a war, it's not just about how your motivations and your will. It's about your capabilities. And very briefly, there are two power resource aces in the hole for Russia. Nuclear weapons. It's casting a shadow over this entire war in many different ways. I can go into some of those details of how, to the Russians' advantage. So the possible use, threatened use, implied or direct use of Russian nuclear weapons, and China. These two. I think it's unlikely, increasingly unlikely, that China is going to allow a strategic military defeat of its ally. And signs that it's heading in that direction, I think, will be met with substantial military and economic assistance from China. And I guess I'll end on that. I have more to say about the issue of why I think it's a stalemate that's going to extend in the future. I also have some ideas on what, if there's a chance for a negotiated truce or settlements. I have an idea on what I think is most likely to work, even though it's probably in the near future not very likely, but it's more likely than what other people are proposing as a solution to this war, which is let's go for all outright victory, all out victory on either side of those statements, and or for some type of negotiated settlement that is on terms that I don't think are attainable. So if you're interested, I can talk in more detail later.
Well, Stephen, why don't you just maybe the broader question about what you think the stakes are, and then anything else that Steve said. That
I basically agree with Steve on part of this. I think certainly Putin's problem right now is that he's in this thing and he has to win it. I agree to that. But
Well, I didn't say he has to avoid
looking
defeat,
right
and he has to avoid some semblance of victory, right?
whatever, some
Yeah.
semblance.
Yeah, right.
But on the other hand, this was a war of choice as well. I'm less sympathetic to the idea that Russia had to invade Ukraine, despite, its westernization, all of this.
I don't think it had to either.
For decades, it had pro-Russian politicians in Ukraine. It was able to use them. And again, it took out, part of Ukraine's territory, was able to use this, like they've done in other areas, these frozen conflicts, to destabilize the country. It's done that in Georgia, it's done that in Moldova, it's done that in other places. It could have continued to do that and destabilized Ukraine. It didn't have to fully occupy and take over the whole country. I don't think that was definitely a choice. And it seems like, in retrospect, a bad choice. And so I'm less sympathetic to Putin's and his earlier remarks also.
I'm not, I have no sympathy for Putin.
I'm not saying you
That's the
do.
essence of
I'm
my
not
comment.
saying you did. I hope you don't. In any case, again,
I'm trying to
I'll,
emphasize I
I'll,
don't.
if you, I don't know, I'll talk to your analyst, maybe you share pro, Putin symptoms or sympathies, how about that? But again, going back, and this is an older thing even in this war. I mean, that Putin gave a diatribe, I don't know exactly what year it was, but claiming that the fall of the Soviet Union was the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century. It was basically a bloodless revolution. It wasn't a catastrophe. We have World War I, we have World War II, we have the Holocaust, Armenian genocide. Anyone want to add anything else that was a greater catastrophe? I mean, this, I think, Steve, you've written on this. I mean, this is his obsession, Putin's obsession. And he was there playing along when it fell apart. And why did it fall apart? Was it because of the West? Was it because of NATO? It fell apart because of Gorbachev's reforms and a failed coup in 1991, which I was an observer to. I was on a night train from Vilnius, Lithuania to Leningrad, which quickly afterwards became St. Petersburg again. We got on the train, we saw sort of security forces and stuff, and I actually sent a postcard from Vilnius saying, it looks like something's happening. Something did happen. We got off the train, and at that time in Leningrad, every Soviet city, there were people everywhere. They were out shopping they leave work to go shopping. There are always people on the streets. No one was on the streets when we got off in the train. The friend we were staying with called his mother. She said, there's been a revolution, get home. And Russia itself also made moves towards sovereignty before Ukraine. Okay, they were earlier to have presidential elections, or before there's a vote on autonomy and there was a vote on elections. This happened. Russia was as much a vehicle for this than little Ukraine was. And so again, I'm less sympathetic to Putin's narrative, and I'm not saying that's your narrative, and I hope it isn't, Steve. But I'm less sympathetic to that. The fall of the Soviet Union was as much more in Russia's hands than Ukraine's or certainly Belarus. And I'm not sure it's. I guess I'm not sympathetic to that.
Let's take one question that was submitted, which says there appears to be increasing pressure in the United States to provide more advanced weapons in greater quantities to Ukraine and to expand the conflict to include an effort to retake Crimea. What would happen if this were to occur? And also maybe the opposite criticism that the US has been, reluctantly just kind of giving a little bit, not going all in, just being very, very incremental and measured to a fall. So how would you evaluate those kind of conflicting criticisms?
This is actually something Steve and I agree on. I think that there is a concern about sort of maximalist demands of both sides. And I think on the Ukrainian side, the idea of taking back Crimea, I'm not sure the US government should be pushing that and maybe should be coaxing the Ukrainians away from that. But I think that domestically for them is very hard. And so I don't know how they would do that. But I think that those sort of maximalist demands, Russia's not going to give up the Black Sea Fleet, even while Crimea was part of Ukraine. There were basically, it was separated, the fleet itself. And again, I saw this with my own eyes. There were these really nice boats that you could see basically where the Ukrainian fleet started and the Russian fleet started. There were a couple of rusty ships on the Ukrainian side and a very modernized, nice fleet on the other side. But they shared Sevastopol, and I don't think it's reality, and I'm sure you don't. I know you don't, Steve.
Oh, yeah, like I was saying, doubt that Putin is going to stand by while Western arms are used by Ukrainians to attack or overrun Crimea. Going back to the general question of Western military aid to Ukraine, it is true there's been a lot of incrementalism. Right? There's been kind of a steady escalation among NATO countries. And so what explains that, first of all, and then evaluate it, whether it's wise or not. But in my view, most likely explanation is fear of a direct conflict with Russia and fear of Russia's escalation of the conflict with nuclear weapons. So there's been that hesitancy, that incrementalism. I mean, early in the war, you might remember that there were calls by Ukrainians, by others in the West, for NATO to close the skies, to have a no-fly zone over Ukraine so that Russian air power can be used to prosecute the war. Those calls were rejected, but there were, actually prior to the war, there were already anti-tank missiles being shipped to Ukraine, anti-aircraft missiles, Stinger missiles, Javelin anti-tank, anti-armor missiles. But early on in the war, now it's a steadily increasing supply of sophisticated and powerful weapons has been shipped to Ukraine. So the West has kind of crossed its own self-imposed lines repeatedly throughout this past year. And yeah, now we're at the stage where main battle tanks, there have been light tanks that already been shipped a while ago. But now several countries are promising main battle tanks, Leopard 2s, Challenger, Abrams M1 tank, United States. And the Ukrainians are requesting fighter jets as well. But so far, there's been a reluctance, just in that term, nobody has said, I haven't seen any major leaders say outright, no, that will never happen. There have been indications that Western leaders are considering it seriously. And so what will bring on those deliveries of Western jets, F-16s especially, is what the Ukrainians want? Well, battlefield failure is the most likely scenario. So then this is the dilemma for the Russians. The more successful they are on the ground, the more likelihood of escalation there is on the other side. The West has deep pockets and a large military arsenal that can be shared, especially with increased defense production. So that's their fundamental challenge. Success on the ground, on the battlefield, will bring additional escalation from the West. I mean, think about it. The West is in this war already. The Russians say, we're fighting not just Ukraine. Our main opponent is the collective West. And you know what? I think they're right. They are fighting the West. Let's be honest. What difference does it make what the nationality is of the person who fires an anti-tank weapon, the person who fires an artillery shell? I think for the Russians, that really is not, that's kind of a nuance. It's not very important. The main facet or the feature of this war is that Western military power is being combined with Ukrainian military power to fight Russian military power. That's an objective fact. Yes, the West doesn't have troops on the ground or in the air over Ukraine, but that's very a minor fact. So the problem for Russia is the GDP of NATO is $47 trillion. The GDP of Russia is $1.8 trillion. Right? So if we think about military potential being dependent on the economic base of the country, especially in the long or medium term or long term, this is not good news for Russia. And so if they were to be surprisingly or substantially successful on the ground, I think you will see these fighter jets and more from the West. So that's the dilemma from their side. And the dilemma from our side is what I mentioned before, that this is a question I don't want an answer to. Will a great power suffer a major military defeat without using the most powerful weapon in its arsenal? I don't want to know the answer to that. I like it as a theoretical, abstract question. But what I fear is that people who are pushing this more ambitious set of political goals and military goals for Ukraine, for the West / Ukraine, I think that they're going to provoke, they're increasing the likelihood greatly of us finding out the answer to that question. So a lot of this debate is over risk acceptance. How willing are you to accept great costs? Right? Because any action can have benefits, can have a substantial chance of benefits, but how willing are you to accept the possible costs? And so that's a value-based question. Lots of different reasonable answers to that, but I think that's one of the cruxes of this debate among the West, although at least publicly, most Western leaders haven't been engaging in this kind of debate about, well, you know what, we need to start thinking more realistically here and rein Ukraine in. I know it's almost blasphemous to say it, but Western leaders have presented have suggested directly and indirectly that there's an identity of interest between Ukraine and NATO members. There's been a deference to the wishes of Ukraine and the war goals and political goals of Ukraine. I have some quotes here, actually. It's a good time, it's real quickly for me. They're really telling of this point I wanted to make. So, there's lots of variants of this refrain among Western political leaders and analysts. Ukraine is fighting for all of us. The G7 in October came out with an official statement. We will stand firmly with Ukraine for as long as it takes. Biden in December. The American people are with you every step of the way, and we will stay as long as it takes. Macron. Ukrainian people should decide the moment and terms of peace. Now, I understand where these sentiments are coming from, but ultimately, and you sort of hinted at this, Steve, it would be very difficult politically, maybe I read you wrong, but very difficult politically for the Ukrainian leadership to scale back its war aims, its political goals. And maybe it's even best for Ukraine. Maybe there's less of a conflict of interest as I'm presenting here. Maybe really what's good for the Ukrainian people is to have a less ambitious set of political goals here. But from the West standpoint, it seems to me that how much more benefit do we get between the following two scenarios? Russian forces are entirely ejected from Ukraine, and Russian forces are withdrawn to the status quo ante, the situation on February 23rd. So imagine if that was the West and Ukraine's war goal, to get things back to where they were on the eve of the invasion. And so this is my proposal, now I'm sort of slipping it in. What I think has the strongest chance for a negotiated truce, and maybe even settlement, but more likely truce. Maybe it will be a truce that lasts for decades, like the North Korean, South Korean truce. So technically they're not at peace. But both sides agreeing that Russian troops will withdraw to Crimea and parts of Donetsk and Luhansk regions. There would be an arrangement for a UN supervised referendum in those two regions in the east and Donbass. for what state they want to belong to, or if they want independence. There would be negotiations around some kind of security guarantee for Ukraine. And possibly even limitations on what kind of Western forces can be stationed on Ukrainian soil. And also some kind of limitations on how close Russian forces can be deployed near Ukrainian borders. Maybe some kind of negotiation on the status of Russian language in Ukraine. A statement, formal official statement on each side that they recognize the sovereignty and statehood of the other side. That would be a victory for Ukraine. Actually, a big symbolic victory, even just that statement. So I think Ukraine doesn't have a chance to get a better deal than that. Even that, I think, is an unrealistic outcome for Ukraine. You want to know my for opinion. But I think that's the best reasonable outcome for Ukraine. The status quo ante. They lived without controlling those territories for 8 years prior to this war. And the referendum may go their way. They may get those two parts of Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast regions back, those provinces. And from the Russian side, at least they can claim, you know what? We've established some kind of limitations on Western military assistance. We've given some protection to the status of the Russian language and ethnic Russian speakers in Ukraine. So, and we didn't lose Crimea, and there's a chance that we can, in an ideal world, I would have this referendum be maybe 10 years from the date of the signing of this kind of truce or agreement. So each side can declare some kind of victory. And Ukraine, we defeated the hegemon, the regional hegemon. The Russians can say, well, they've agreed to some restrictions, right? So NATO, that Ukraine will never become part of NATO. Yeah, maybe the United States and Britain, two members of NATO, will give some kind of security guarantee to Ukraine, but not NATO. Not NATO can tout that as a victory. See, this special military operation resulted in the formal neutrality of Ukraine. It will not be part of a military alliance. So, and all that, for this to be realistic at all, I need to emphasize this. The United States and China need to broker this. They need to put pressure on these parties and guarantee that they follow any agreement that's made. Because one of the major problems with any sort of military agreement, ceasefire or peace treaty, is each side is thinking, is the other side going to honor their commitment that they made? It's a big problem. So if Russia and Ukraine, their promises are backed up by the pressure of the two strongest countries in the world, they're more likely to make that agreement in the first place. Each side will know, the West will know that China is going to put pressure on Russia to live up to the deal. And vice versa, Russia will know that Ukraine is going to be pressured by the United States.
Can I jump in there? Just
Yeah.
one question that maybe Stephen can jump, which says, as it relates to this conflict, what is China up to now? What is going on in the leadership, and what signals can we infer from?
Yeah, again, the Chinese equivalent foreign minister was in Moscow today. And so I think they are in, as Steve said, what they're going to do, what they're going to provide is Russia also talked about Taiwan openly. And so I think, yeah, and I agree that I think the Chinese certainly don't want the Russians to lose. Now, going back to what Steve said about the Europeans also are not, there's a difference within, again, I teach a class on European politics, and I reorganized the course this last fall to deal with the war in Ukraine and how it is affecting Europe. And what you have there, you certainly have some of the countries, especially the Baltic states, that definitely want to do everything possible, and they're doing everything possible. The biggest donor of money and weapons and so forth per capita is little Estonia, which has 1.3 million people. Again, per capita, they're giving the most. And the other Baltic states, but not also, again, Poland, lots of countries that have lived under Soviet rule do not want Ukraine to succeed. So Europe's in a situation as well where, again, I agree. I think the status quo ante would be a plus. It would end the bloodshed and so forth. Although on the Ukrainian side, what Steve mentioned about having China and the US, the problem is the Ukrainians gave up their nuclear weapons in the 1990s, and this Budapest memorandum was supposed to provide them
Well, the
support.
term was security assurances.
Right, well,
There was
whatever
never
it
a
is.
guarantee.
Well, there wasn't I agree, there wasn't a guarantee, but are the Ukrainians going to buy a new guarantee?
No, they won't buy security assurances anymore. They know that that was nothing.
Right.
They will require something firmer for sure.
Well, whether they will think that it's firm enough is a different question, and I don't know. But going back to the statement from Tim Snyder, the European Union, Europe in general, does not want to live next to a Russia that wins in Ukraine either. And I think they have enough in this that they might go longer than you want them to go. And again, and perhaps lots of Ukrainians and lots of Russians will die as a result. But they don't, that's in their neighborhood. And again, this is looking more like, my prepared comments also was that this is, this is an interstate war on the European continent that we haven't seen since World War II. In fact, interstate wars aren't very common in any part of the world. I don't see an easy end to this as well. But I think the Europeans also don't want, they don't want Putin to win. And maybe they're not going to win. And maybe the Ukrainians aren't going to win. But it's not easy, Putin, you're saying, can't back out.
I think it will be very difficult
Right.
to expect him to back out.
But can the Europeans back out? Also sort of morally back out? Can the Americans back out at this point and watch the Ukrainians get slaughtered?
No, Americans precisely, neither side will back down. Neither side can win, and neither side wants to back down completely. And so almost certainly we're doomed for many years of this conflict going on. There's a small chance in my mind for some diplomacy led by China and the United States. It would take great statecraft to do it. I don't know if Biden has been, or Trump, or any other leader that might become president anytime soon. I don't know if they have the skill and to do it. Xi Jinping, I'm not sure either. But you mentioned you don't know if some kind of solution would be acceptable to Ukrainians. The problem for Ukrainians is they cannot conduct this war without the United States and Europe. They will be destroyed tomorrow. So ultimately, the shots can be called by the Western partners of Ukraine. And the same is true for China and Russia. China is buying huge amounts of Russian natural gas and oil, selling semiconductors to Russia. There's fear in the United States in the last few days. It's come out, U.S. government officials are concerned that soon China will start arming Russia. So Russia can't last long without the backing of China. Neither of these parties can conduct and prosecute the war without these patrons. So that's why I think, that, you know, there's gonna be some kind of a truce, extended truce. We're gonna need that. And you mentioned, right, so the opposite of my argument, the argument for we gotta teach a lesson and teach other autocrats a lesson, right? We can't, anything short of total victory, by the way, so the Ukrainian core objectives here are to rid Ukrainian territory entirely of Russian military forces. What I think is the core Russian goal, it's hard to know for sure, is to maintain in perpetuity control of Crimea, extend their control to both full territory of these two eastern provinces, the Donetsk region, and maybe also, well, I think as a minimum, also they want to maintain partial control, the control they have now of Kherson and Zaporizhia regions, and maybe they want the entire territory of each of those regions. So, 4 regions, they've already annexed these 4, right? In September. So I think that's probably the core goal for Russia. I don't think they're going to get it, and I don't think Ukraine's going to get its core goal of no Russian troops whatsoever wherever on Ukrainian territory.
I think you forgot denazification, Steve, that they want to get rid of the government. They want to get rid of the Nazis, and that means control of the government.
Well, there's the issue of core, so primary goals, secondary goals, core interests, secondary interests. So look, we all have goals. We all have lots of goals, lots of desires. The question is, do we have the ability to get them, and are we willing to pay the costs to get them? So yeah, they want to control Kiev, the Kiev government. Sure, that's a goal. But is it a core goal? Is it this thing that they're going to walk away from this conflict with? If they don't get it, is it going to be a catastrophe for them? Or is it going to be considered for them a huge military defeat? I don't think so. What I think will be considered a huge military defeat is if all Russian forces are off the territory of Ukraine, including Crimea. So yeah, you're right. They talk about denazification, demilitarization. It wasn't even ever clear what they meant by these aims, these goals.
Regime change.
Another question is, with all the sanctions that have been levied against Russia, how come it's had so little effect on its economy? I think it's just contracted slightly and it's projected to grow actually this year. What's going on?
I think some of that is, and even US officials and others have said that some of that is more long-term. We're not going to see it right away. Right, I think the GDP only went down by something like 2% or something.
2.2.
2.2. But I think some of these things are going to hit. The fact they're not getting semiconductors, that they're having to use, chips from washing machines for their weapons and stuff. Some of the stuff is going to hit. And perhaps again, the Chinese coming in would be able to do something for that. But the Chinese don't even have the kind of chips that the Russians need for their military either. We do, and other Western countries like the Netherlands. The other thing is part of the fact that Europe is no longer buying anything from them. Okay. And some of that stuff, sure, they can put on a boat. It's much harder to do that with their gas. It will take them a long time to divert all the natural gas to Asia. I've read something, it would take like 10 years or more to do that. They are in a very difficult situation economically, a very difficult situation. They do have part of their middle class that's left. Again, it's a pretty small number. Maybe 500,000 is what I saw more recently of people who left, not just the draft dodgers, but other people that have left. They are people you don't want to lose. Russia has a terrible demographic balance. Very few young people, and life expectancy not that great. It doesn't look great for them. So again, I think without Chinese support, I think they are screwed. But again, today it doesn't look bad, but I wouldn't want to be in charge of balancing the budget. They're taking money from their state investment vehicle. But at some point, I read something recently if they actually use that to plug the budget, that would last for 2 years. And so, it doesn't look good long-term.
Okay, so, right, the IMF recently announced that they've assessed the drop in GDP in Russia over 2022 to 2.2%, and they project a 0.3% growth rate this year. That's puzzling. That was one of my surprises that I had prepared to talk about. I mean, there's several reasons, several things going on here. One, they instituted capital controls when these sanctions hit, like you couldn't sell your rubles for foreign currencies. You individuals, businesses, banks couldn't do that. They aggressively raised interest rates. Then there's a question of they've been spending down Russian central bank reserves. So prior to the war, there was $640 billion of reserves the central bank had. I'm not gonna say controlled yet. Had $313 billion of those reserves were in Western banks in the United States, in New York City, in banks in New York City. Those have been frozen. Those $313 billion, but the rest of the $640 billion is in gold and other currencies like the Chinese yuan and Indian rupee and some other minor currencies. They've been spending that now. Trade imports, they've been receiving, their import level is recovered. It's now where it was prior to the war. So there's lots of countries in the world willing to sell Russian goods, including our ally Turkey. Interestingly, they're selling them lots of stuff, including semiconductors.
Yeah, dual usage stuff.
Right. So there's there's a bunch of factors, but I don't want anybody to think that, well, someone must think that these economic sanctions aren't working. That's not my position at all. Number one, as Steve said, there's a short run effect and a long run effect. I think there's going to be a more powerful long run effect that will degrade Russian economic power and thus long-term military power. But I think it's Russian declining power in any case. In terms of the goal, there's some goal things real briefly. One is you try to coerce the target to change a policy you don't like. In this case, we're using the West and Ukraine, we're using military force to try to coerce, have that coercive effect. Lay down your arms and accede to our political demands, right? But there's also these economic sanctions which are aimed at trying to coerce that same result. So that's one potential goal of economic sanctions. Another major one is to deter third parties, especially in the future. Right? Look at this example. When a country commits this kind of aggression, here's how we're going to respond, and likely will respond the same way in the future if you, some third party, engages in the same kind of behavior. So these sanctions can succeed on that ground. But even if the coercive element is a failure, there can still be that. And the degrading of Russian military power in the longer term can still happen. And maybe most importantly, the West is making a very important symbolic statement that this is wrong, right? This is a violation of international law. This invasion is a violation of international law. It's a violation of norms, proper conduct by states. And so it's a very powerful message that's being sent around the world. And so it can succeed at that level. So I'm a very strong supporter of sanctions.
Final question. If we're invited back a year from now and I open it up and
I said we
say,
will.
well, where are we now? I mean, I know I'm not asking you to do crystal ball, but just based on all that you've seen, what is the most likely scenario in February of 24?
I think the conflict will still be going on. Again, my friends in Ukraine are very optimistic. These are the same people who I was actually in the Baltic states this summer and was told multiple times to come. You just, you get to, Poland and then you take a train. It's easy. I don't do that. Steve, you might, I don't know, but I don't go to war zones. I study them. I don't go to them. I did see some exciting things like the fall of the Soviet Union. I saw with my eyes. And I went into, demonstrations of 500,000 people, and it was exhilarating. I liked that. I saw people hacking at the Dzerzhinsky monument in Moscow. It was the former head of the KGB. It was very exciting. But I don't go into countries that are getting bombed by choice. And so, no, thank you. But I think we'll be here.
And do you think that the military situation will be broadly what it is right now?
Again, I don't think the Ukrainians are going to get what they want, and I agree with Steve. I don't think the Russians are going to get what they want. How it is, again, I'm not a military analyst. How it's going to look on the battlefield in a year from now, again, I don't have that crystal ball. But it's going to be very hard. Again, as we've said, overall, it's going to be very hard for the Ukrainians to give up. It's going to be very hard for the Russians to give up. Right now, if it's looking like it is right now, there isn't a lot of movement on either side. You have incremental movement on either side, and that would be my guess for a year from now.
Yeah, I mean, as you probably inferred from my previous comments, I think that we're in store for exactly what we've seen the last few months. Which is not some quick moving war of maneuver and developments. This has turned into a war of attrition, heavily reliant on artillery fire. And I think that's with very little movement, sort of trench warfare, very little movement across the front lines. I think that's the likeliest. Who knows? Everybody's making a guess. But due to the incentive structure on each side, due to the power capability on each side, I don't think either is going to have much in the way of military and political success. And yeah, so the tragedy will continue. And look, in my view, the biggest losers, I'm trying to think of who are the biggest winners and the biggest losers in this war.
Well, just even say a word about Zelensky and Putin and just how you would assess the year they've had.
Again, I think Putin has had a terrible year. And again, he's gotten himself into a terrible position, and it's his own choice. I don't feel sorry for him. Zelensky, I didn't like initially when he ran for president. He's a populist. I don't like populists. But he has, again, surprised everyone, including the Ukrainian public, including those that didn't vote for him. He's the Churchill of our era. I mean, he's a Energizer bunny. He's everywhere, and he's done a very good job of getting countries to give him everything. And he's won a lot of goodwill. Again, I wouldn't have voted for him. I'm not sure I would, but I guess that doesn't matter, does it?
Steve?
Well, let's start with, there's an important distinction here. What I think of Putin and what the Russians think of Putin. I think he's had a disaster. I think he's made grave miscalculations on what would happen when he sends in 130, all sorts of things. 130,000, 150,000, 190,000, whatever, a large attack. 3, if not 4, separate vectors. South and southeast, northeast and north. It's massive military invasion, as opposed to what I thought would be more like a much more limited one. So I think he's had a terrible year. But here's the thing. He and his regime control the mass media to a greater extent than before the war. And there are lots of reasonable people in Ukraine. In fact, some intelligent analysts, like Oleg, directed me to some of the writings of these guys. Who, one of them I was quite familiar with, Dmitry Brennan, very smart guy, reasonable guy for years, in analysis of foreign politics. He basically buys the regime's line on the contour of who's responsible for how we got here. And that's a powerful thing. I've been watching over the last month, been watching some of the what are called Putin's propagandas on primetime TV. There's several of them. And you might think, how can a reasonable Russian believe sort of the Russian narrative? It seems really kind of ridiculous. That reasonable people, smart people would buy the narrative he's selling. Well, here's the thing. These propagandists, they're smart. They're well-spoken. They're attractive. And here's the thing also. They don't hide what the Western criticism of Russia. They directly address it. They give long quotes. They show video clips of Western leaders speaking, Western analysts speaking. So it's not like Russians aren't getting any of the Western perspective. They're getting it. But then these guys come in and they spin it and they interpret it in a way that makes the argument, at least, that the West is responsible for provoking this war. The United States wants world hegemony. It wants to destroy Russia as a state. In fact, there is some talk now in the West about the desirable disintegration of Russia. You can imagine that's being hammered home on these shows. These folks are clever. Some females here. Skapieva, for those of you who know, Simonian. So they've controlled the mass media. They've controlled the masses' interpretation of this conflict, and the proof is in the pudding. How many mass protests have you seen in the last year? There were a few, the first 3 or 4 weeks of this war. You had something like 17,000, 18,000 people detained. Who knows how many were actually, imprisoned? But those petered out pretty quick. Those initial protests. There were some protests and a little bit of violence during the mobilization of 300,000 troops in the fall in September. That petered out. So we think he's done terrible. I think he's done terribly, but I don't think the Russian masses think so. And as for Zelensky, he's a master. I mean, it's hard to think of a more sympathetic and effective spokesperson for his country, for his nation. I mean, the guy's, I would say, a brilliant communicator. And think about it, when you see him, he's dressed as an everyday person, right? He wears a green t-shirt, long sleeve or short sleeve, boots. And I think intentionally or unintentionally, I mean, the effect is striking when you compare him to Putin, sort of rigid, stern Putin, a guy who's trying real hard to project gravitas. And then you have Zelensky, who comes across as just a regular guy, fighting hard for his country, this victim of brutal aggression from the Russians. And it's hard not to sympathize with him. And he's one of the main authors of this argument that we're fighting for the West, which I think is sold a lot of Westerners and politicians, this identity of interests. So in that sense, especially, he's been effective for Ukrainians. I mean, Ukraine is like the hero country of the world in many people's eyes. And I think a lot of that is due, well, to the soldiers, to the effectiveness of these everyday soldiers, but also to this symbol of Ukrainian people. Zelensky.
And also, I think for the Ukrainians, that they haven't had a politician like this. I mean, the whole idea that a Ukrainian politician wouldn't flee when the Russians came in was really surprising. It was surprising to me that he didn't flee.
I need ammunition, not a ride.
Almost every other Ukrainian politician would have fled. And so the fact that the Ukrainian public are seeing this politician who did not flee is, I think, surprising for most of them. And I agree with Steve. I think that the difference between the propaganda in Russia today and Soviet propaganda is a lot. And the communist regime, people didn't believe the propaganda. Now I don't know if it's the Fox News effect or what. They are getting it and they are believing it. Even stuff that's very, very outlandish. Which is again, there have been stuff. The New Yorker did a series of articles on this a few years ago about the sort of guy who came up with this sort of mix for the propaganda mix. It's scary, but I think it's effective.
Well, thank you for just really a terrific conversation. Obviously, it's been a hard subject and this is a really, I think, a good description of the views and the state of play. Thanks for people who joined us online. We had a good audience there, and thanks for all you who came out. And I think we're gonna have a reception out front and continue this conversation. So thanks so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the team here who did a wonderful job.